Welcome back to my channel. My name is Brianna, where I talk about crochet, spirituality, all things of that nature. And if you like that kind of content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I have my Aquarius back with me today, and that means it's another astrology video. So today's video we're going to be talking about the houses of astrology and what on earth that even means. So in the last video I talked to you about the zodiac sign. The problem is that when you look at your birth chart, you don't just see your zodiac signs, right? And I'll show you a link below on where to put your information to get your birth chart. So when you look at your birth chart, you're like, oh, I see some signs, but why do I see all the signs? Oop, that's kind of weird. I see these little pizza looking triangles. Oop, that's kind of weird. And that's because those are your houses. So there's 12 houses in astrology. And when you're looking at your birth chart and you see all those 12 pizza slices, they indicate what that means for your life, okay? So it starts off with your rising sign, like right here. And your rising sign is basically the sign of your first house. And I'll begin to talk about that later on. And as it goes through the course, the last sign of the last pizza slice of your rising sign would be your 12th house. So it goes 1 2 3 all the way through 12, and those different 12 houses have different indications to them. So the zodiac signs assigned to those 12 houses show how that house plays a role in your life, right? And also the planets, which we'll talk about in another video, shows how all the things will play out. Think of your birth chart as a story, okay? Your zodiac signs, the houses, and the planets are the 3 most important things that you have to know in order to read your birth chart. Shameless plug. Once again, I have my Soul's Astrology shop below, and therefore you can purchase my ebook where I talk about all these things in depth. And something to keep in mind when looking at your houses, you want to look at what sign the house is in, right? Because I'm going to tell you the signs that are ruled by the house. So once again, referencing the first house, when you're talking about the first house is ruled by Aries. It's a fire sign. So if you have, let's say, a earth sign in your first house, those things contradict each other. You have fire and then you have calm. They don't really interact. So maybe your first house may come off as more conservative. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And I talked about that in the first video with the element. The next thing that I'm going to be talking about is whether the house is angular, succedent, or cadent. So what this means is that an angular house is a dominant house. It plays a very important role in your life. A succedent means that it doesn't play that much of a role in your life. And a cadent plan means that you might or might not be affected by this. Okay, so that's kind of how you want to say it, like most important, kind of important, not that important. That's how it goes. So you have angular, succedent, and cadent. Let's get into the first house. So your first house is angular. So that means that it is very, very important. It plays a very important role on your life. Your first house is associated with fire, it's associated with Aries, and associated with Mars. Like I said in the first video, when you think about Aries, you think about starting something. It's the first sign of the zodiac. It's coming out with a boom, and that's why it's in your first house. Because your first house is you. It's how yourself is represented. It's your personality. It's your outlook on life, and it's an indicator of your behavior. So your second house is ruled by Venus. It is associated with Taurus and is associated with earth signs. That being said, if in your second house you have Taurus or you have an earth sign, that means a good indication that you're really good with money. And the reason for that is because your second house is associated with money, it's associated with possessions. It's associated with resources and personal finances. And this can also indicate how your starting life was. So if you don't have an earth sign in your second house, or you don't have a sign that indicates monetary wealth, then it means that your upbringing was probably very frugal. It is also a succedent house, so it's not as important as the first house, but still plays a very important role in your life. The third house is ruled by Mercury. It's associated with Gemini, and it's associated with air signs. It's a cadent house, and I talked about what that meant earlier. And your third house is really associated with your communication and how you grew up. It's associated with your early education and your environment growing up. So for example, if you have Gemini in this house, which is not bad, right? Because it has all the listing here of good indication, but it can indicate chaos as well. Like you had a lot of chaos in your house. You had a lot of two different rivaling figures, because when we talk about Gemini, we're talking about the twins. So we're talking about both parents in this house, or regardless if that's a wife and a husband, we're talking about two adult figures. It might be good, and then it also might be bad, but that's just some indications of what you can tell based off of that. Your fourth house is associated with the moon. It's associated with Cancer, and it's associated with water signs. This is another angular house, so it's very, very important. And the reason why is because it's associated with your home, your roots, and it's also associated with your mother. So it talks about the role that your mother played in your life in that house. So for example, if you have Mars in this house, you may have had a little bit of an overbearing mother. If you've had an actual water sign, if you have Cancer sign in this house, your mother might have been amazing. She might have been nurturing. She might have been very sensitive to your emotions. But once again, you have to do more delving deep into your birth chart to fully understand those dynamics. But from the gist of it, that's kind of what you can pick up. So your fifth house is associated with the sun. Associated with Leo, and it's also associated with fire signs. This is a succedent house. It talks about children. It talks about whether you have kids or not, creativity, independence. It's a very creative house, so it talks about how you will express yourself in this world. It talks about your talents, your pleasures. If you have an air sign in this house, you might be very creative. You might be an artist, you might be a dancer, anything associated with that. So your sixth house is associated with the planet Mercury. It is associated with earth signs, and it's also associated with the sign Virgo. So when you're thinking about Virgo, you're thinking about a very feminine sign that can be very nurturing, and that's why the sixth house is associated with home matters. So your health, your jobs, your responsibilities, your diet, your hygiene, anything that resolves around like personal building, right? So your jobs, yourself, and that's what it talks about, how that's gonna play out. So for example, if you have Saturn in this house, Saturn being a very problematic planet, you might have some issues with your health. You might have some issues with jobs, and that's kind of what the sixth house encompasses. So your seventh house is ruled by Venus. His seventh house is ruled by Venus. It's associated with the sign Libra, and it's also associated with air signs. This is an angular house, so it's very important. I don't know if I mentioned the sixth house is a cadent house, but the seventh house is angular, so it's very important. And the reason why it's very important because it talks about romance. Remember what I said in the first video, Libra is associated with romance, and so is Venus. So this house talks about relationships, partners, marriages, building relationships with anyone. So for example, if you have Libra in this house, you might have a good time finding romantic partners. However, if you have Aries, you might find a very harder time. For example, very stubborn type of love. Maybe that's something that you like, or maybe if you have Aquarius in this house, you may have a chaotic kind of love, and it's hard for you to form relationships and partners. But if you have a water sign who's known for being very nurturing and emotional, it might work out in your favor. The next house is the eighth house. So it talks about, it is ruled by Pluto. It is associated with Scorpio, and it's associated with water. It's a succedent sign, and it also has characteristics of being intuitive. Your intuitive nature, your psychic abilities, your inheritance, your transformation, how you will experience change in your life. That's what the eighth house is for. It's very important, And for anyone who is looking into what gifts they may have psychologically or spiritually, looking at the 8th house and understanding the 8th house is where you got to go for that. So your 9th house is ruled by Jupiter, it's associated with Sagittarius, and it's also associated with fire. And with all these things considered, it is associated with higher consciousness, it's associated with energy, long journeys, philosophy, religion, and travel. So if you have Taurus in this house, for example, you might not really want to travel very often. You might be very stubborn to looking into new religions. You might be very fixed and set on the religion that you were assigned, that was brought to you at birth. It also talks about your long-term career. So while the 6th house talks about like jobs, like this house is talking about like long-term, where do you see yourself, what's the best fit for you. And the reason why that is because when you get to the 10th house, that's ruled by Saturn, associated with Capricorn and associated with Earth sign, this is the house of your midhaven, right? So in between the 9th and 10th house, your midhaven associates yourself with what your life's journey and your life's dedication will be. So it's associated with your reputation, your responsibilities, and it's also associated with your father. This is another angular house, so this is also very important. Keynote, you might notice that the mommy house and the daddy house are very important. So mommy issues and daddy issues can play a really big role in our life, especially when we're looking at our birth chart and what we were assigned at birth. So because it's your midhaven, it also discusses your reputation and like how people will see you. Some people who have Leo midhavens, for example, might be very famous. They might be actresses and singers. They might have a reputation of being in the spotlight. I think Doja Cat has a Leo midhaven, and that's an example of that. The next house is the 11th house. It is ruled by Saturn and Uranus. It is associated with the sign Aquarius, and it is associated with air signs. The 11th house is associated with friendships, goals, hopes. And because Aquariuses are so involved with society, it also talks about where you will be involved in society, how you will place yourself in society. So if you have a Scorpio nature and Scorpio in this house, you might not really be into all that. Like you might want to be focused on yourself. You might not have very much friends. However, if you have Libra in this house, you might be loaded with friends. You might see yourself in a career where you're often talking to people, or you might always be finding new friends, so that's something to consider. Your 12th house is the last house. It's associated with Pisces and water signs. It is a cadent house, and it is associated with the planets Jupiter and Neptune. And now this is the house of intuition, and this is the house of your deepest, darkest feelings. It talks about your hidden emotions, your secrets, your fears, your subconscious, the things that you don't really want to see come to light. And an example of this, if you are a Taurus in this house, if you have Taurus in this house, you might not be willing to share your fears with anyone. You might be very stubborn. If you have Cancer in this house, you might want to overshow to everyone, you know. So that's just another thing to consider when you're talking about the houses. So I talked about all 12 houses. If you have any questions in the description in this video, please let me know in the comments. I'll try to answer all the questions. Once again, I have a book about these things if you want to read it and if you want to have it for yourself. The link for that will be down in below. Once again, my name is Brianna. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please, if you like this content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.